Welcome to what we're now going to head into, which is the world of imagination. I'm going to speak as little as possible to make as much time for our young change makers and our other panelists as humanly possible, but essentially just really to start by recapping a lot of which was spoken about yesterday. And that's really the importance of your imagination, your being each and every one of yours imagination when it comes to our future. And I'll stick with that word future because I know a lot of futurists like to talk about these multiple futures ahead. Yes, in the present, but the future perfect that we actually arrive at together. And it's our future that has to be negotiated together to get us from here to there and the other way around, from there back to here, which we'll talk a little bit today. So I really got interested in this topic about 5 years ago when I wrote this book called The Future Starts Now with a bunch of futurists all across the world. And the thesis behind this was really that our future stories have ended up being kind of simplified and tracked because we keep on extrapolating past performance into the future, which paints us into some corners. It limits our imagination. And unfortunately, also as a trained economist, I know that what we believe and what we imagine has a direct feedback loop directly back into our reality. We know, especially if you train in economics, our central bankers know that if you set expectations, you change people's behavior. If you lead people to believe the future is going to be scarce, that they're going to be less jobs, they're going to take less risks in what they study, and their futures will therefore become limited. If you're going to tell people that inflation is going to increase, well, then people are going to, again, take less risks when it comes to investing, when it comes to where they invest their personal money and how people start businesses. So the thesis is expectations do shape our reality. And therefore, it becomes almost a moral responsibility of all of us to use our imagination to extend that possibility space into a greater, bigger, more diverse direction, right? That it takes us beyond the trap of the forecast into the possible of the futures, which is where futures and foresight interact so beautifully. Forecasting tells us the likely case ahead, which I know Yaki and everyone spoke so beautifully about yesterday. But foresight should be about asking the question, what if? What if we divert off that base case future? And here also, there's the second point that is where really makes imagination so important. And that is, as a history of our entire species, our future has been dreamed before it was built. We told stories of the world we wanted, the world we hoped for, the world we feared, and then we created that world, either based on our fears or based on our best imagination. Whether you look back at the early days of Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, the very first ideas of things like artificial intelligence started out as a story, and that ended up being the world that we built. But some of those stories we tell are obviously more empowering and more beautiful, and others are less. Some of those stories can trap us, and some of those stories can lead us forward. And that's why critically, that's something that I've been very passionate about for very many years, is our future needs your stories. It needs more stories. We need less monoculture future stories ahead of us. We need a more diverse flourishing of possible futures that can all inform what ultimately becomes our collective future singular, the world that we will all again live in and share space in. And that's also why I think it's also very important, before we continue with some of the stories that we are going to bring for you today of imagination, that when it comes to using stories and imagination to influence the future, the sorts of stories and the sorts of imagining that actually enhance agency and that change us so that we can get past those base case forecasts that tend to, as I said, get you in a kind of reinforcing, self-forecasting kind of a loop. The stories that we tell have to be three things in particular that I found. I've been looking at this for quite a long time. Firstly, the stories of imagination we tell should be desirable. They should be better than what we have now. They should be good. They should feel good. At the same time, they need to be plausible. Again, this is what the ISS does so beautifully. All their forecasts ahead, as optimistic as they are plausible. They're based on cause and effect. If we increase investment here, we'll get an increase in results over there. That future must be plausible, but it must be exciting enough to be desirable, to take us away from the forecast that traps us in the world of the same patterns, especially in the case of Africa. Africa, even in the most optimistic forecast that we have, We still plotted that our GDP will be growing at a much slower rate than the rest of the world, and that divide will continue increasing. That's a story that becomes a perpetuating loop. We want more desirable, futures. What if we weren't constrained with the past? What if we were able to start with something more extraordinary, more beautiful, more exciting, more good? That at the same time is still believable. So we need to balance that desirability and the plausibility. But then there's the most important bit that I think a lot of people get wrong, especially leaders who hope to inspire agency and action among people, but fail to do so. And this is why I want to bring out the third word, that of inclusive. Stories about the future, however desirable and however plausible they are, will not inspire action or instill agency among the people. The people, that's us, all of us individuals across our continent, across the world, who are going to have to make the choices that build that future, will not change their actions unless they not only believe the story is desirable, that they want to be part of it, that it is plausible, that it is possible that we can get there and not just a fantasy, but they have to be inclusive. And that means the stories we tell have to have a fulfilling, vital, important role for each and every person, that they can see themselves being a part of that future, not just as a spectator, but actually as a participant, a key lead role, main character energy, as the kids are saying today. That's what a good story about the future, that instills action, that converts imagination into action and connects those dots, desirable, plausible, and inclusive. And that whole thesis led us to the project that got me invited here today, which is the Afro Futures 2050 project. There's a QR code there. If you want to scan it, go ahead and do it. This is an entirely voluntary run organization. We've got some of our co-founders who talk to us a bit later today. And the idea here is that the stories about Africa in particular, stories about humanity in general, let's be honest, are quite binary. We either talk about sort of climate collapse, or we talk about AI singularity. All these are very sort of dark ideas that paint us into a corner. The stories about our far futures are not particularly desirable, plausible, or inclusive at the moment. And the only way to change that is to start by telling new stories. But those stories can't be told by the same old usual suspects from the same old backgrounds with the same old biases, or we're going to end up again with these self-limiting futures. And the idea with this project was quite simply to get Africans to tell their own stories about the world they want to live in the year 2050, starting with a blank page. Not starting with the constraints of today, so kind of the opposite of the forecasting way of looking at the future, starting with the blank page. What do we want? What do we want? What do we want? And I don't think many people have actually been asked that many times in your life. How many times did your teachers, did your leaders tell you, what do you actually want? What is the future that you want? Do you see yourself a part of that? And that's the question that we asked. And we started asking people all over the continent to start contributing stories. We've got our first little volume published at the moment. But the ISS was kind enough to pick this up, this idea, which is a free and open idea. There's absolutely no gatekeeping here. Go ahead, start a chapter, do it yourself. Don't even bother about having to like credit this movement. Just go out and tell those stories that you want, so we can start moving the needle and instilling that agency. But the ISS was so kind to pick this up and put out a call to young change makers across the continent, of which they got, I think, something like 600 responses of stories of positive visions for the future of Africa. And if you were at the conference in person yesterday, you would have actually received the top 5 stories in printed format, a wonderful little booklet, which I definitely encourage you to share and pass around. You know, like they say with the Sun newspaper, it gets read by many more people than it's purchased by. Pass it around, share these stories, and start being inspired to take those words into action. The other thing that we can also notice that I think you can also find, although the organizers can correct me, that you'll also be able to find all those stories available online too. But I'm going to start just by, again, all of our young change makers, give a wave, the top 5 of you over here, just share your faces. We're going to be talking to each of you about some of what I thought were the most profound lines in your stories, and asking you just to share a bit more about the thought behind it. So the words we speak over ourselves, over our children, over our continent are things that matter. They plant the seeds that will inspire some young child to go out and study something different, to start some project, to write another story that inspires the next generation. These are powerful things. We tend to think about words as somehow being like almost lesser than, but they're not. They are the source. And I don't know how religious many of you, but many religions also unpack this, the power of the words that we speak over ourselves. And neuroscience tells us the same things too. we connect our future selves. We have empathy with our future selves when we believe that we can see ourselves in that different role in the future. The neuroscience tells us that people are able to envisage their own careers, their own lives playing out in greater detail, have a better chance of actually achieving those dreams. And we need to start thinking about this, not just individuals, but also continentally, to really fundamentally change the narrative, which will ultimately change the direction of our continent and get us to get some more exponential growth, to go off the sort of the best possible case based on current reality into a much richer future ahead. I'd now like to move on to actually the person who had the highest rated story of all out of all the submissions that we got. And that is Mashudu Malefi. Do you want to just pop on your microphone and give us a wave? We'd love to speak to you there. There you are. Great. Congratulations. There were so many stories to contend with, but yours really struck a nerve with everyone who had to make the very, very hard choices of deciding which of these stories we could showcase, because obviously there were only so few that we could find time for in this platform. But I want to start with some of the words that you had here and also get you to comment on what your thoughts were on that. And you spoke about, they spoke of youth bulges, fragility, instability, yet Africans themselves began to speak differently. Across the continent, a quiet revolution of language unfolded. Leaders, activists, teachers, and creators began to reject the deficit narrative. And I think that's just so beautiful because it speaks exactly what I was saying. You got to reject the labels and then move forward. But what do you think those most important stories, narratives, words, means, metaphors are that we need to change and challenge when it comes to talking about ourselves and the words we speak over Africa?
I think there are plenty, and yeah, I'd encourage people to read my piece to go in depth into like most of them. But top of mind is something that Prof. Roo referred to yesterday in the Foresight Dialogue around African states being referred to as Africa, as opposed to like recognizing that we have 54 unique markets. So I would say the narrative that we need to sort of deviate from is viewing Africa from this monolithic lens. So I think Africa is one house, but the house has 54 unique rooms, and with kids, every kid wants, maybe the girl wants their room painted in pink, someone else wants a bunk bed instead of like a single bed, some other kid wants a queen size bed in their room. So I think just that whole thing. And for me, this also became very apparent when I was working on a project that was focused on studying or how we could navigate Africa's payments landscape, right? And what I realized from that is that most people view Africa's payment landscape from a single lens. But if you look at North Africa, Hawala networks are thriving, because there are regions where people are underbanked or unbanked. My colleague from the DRC, Justin, could speak about how M-Pesa is thriving in that region because people are more prone to using things like mobile money services. And if you think of like countries like Nigeria, you have crypto adoption going on. So stable coins are a thing there. But if you look at a country like South Africa, it's a completely different sort of payment sort of landscape. And I think something else, another narrative that I think we should also deviate from is something that I think Dr. Silias touched on his keynote, and that was around our demographic dividend, which my piece is literally embedded on. The fact that 1 in 4 people are going to be African by 2050. That's so powerful. We shouldn't downplay that. And there's this amazing TED Talk I once watched by a lady by the name of Farai Mubaiwa around how we are the ones we've been waiting for. So all we need as Africans is not aid, but we need a seat at the table. So yeah, I think those two are what I'll leave people with. We need to view Africa from the context of it being a house, but the house has very different rooms, and you need to look at the different rooms in in their individuality as opposed to looking at them as this monolithic thing. And then also very important to also acknowledge and recognize the fact that we have this powerful dividend, which is the young people, and they are going to be the future workforce. So it's not, we shouldn't look at the young people as something that we're going to leverage from in the future, but we should start leveraging from them right now as we approach the 2.5 billion population mark, and us being 1 in 4. It's important that we take cognizance of that, but also leverage from it as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And as you said, do go and read the full stories. We've actually made a video version of yourself and Justin's story too, but they were just too long to play in the session because the stories are so rich. So we're going to encourage people to go and have a look at those, read through the content, read those words, speak those words over your community, and really think about it, because there's not just a vision in these stories, there's also a recipe as to how to get there. People are curious as to how you share your stories, how you share your content, how you share your ideas, and how you stay connected. I mean, the obvious answer is you participate in platforms like this. You show up where there's an opportunity and off you go there. But I can see you nodding there, Mashudu. Maybe you want to come in as our first prize in the story competition representative. How do you stay connected, and how do you make sure your point of view and your voice is heard? Advice for other change makers.
Yeah. I think I call it the idea muscle. So I think to consistently keep my idea muscle engaged, I consistently write. So I have my own Substack publication where I make sure I publish at least one piece a month. It's called This Month in Africa. And then I have a podcast as well called Untapped Azena, where I tap into some of the things that I've been curious about. So it's a bi-weekly pod, also consistent with that, because it also is important to train my idea muscle. And then I also have a blog for sort of the agency that I run called Onyx Africa. So for that, I have Onyx Africa Key Themes, where I go into some interesting themes. The most recent piece was on vibe coding and how I sort of believe that this next generation is where the idea guy wins. So that goes into aspects such as that. Another thing I've been exploring recently is the Web3 landscape in Africa. So engaging with different founders and understanding how they're utilizing blockchain technology to make a change in the African context. So from platforms that are using USSD for people to send and receive Bitcoin, given that most people don't have smartphones. That's a platform called Machankura, to platforms like Empower that are giving people that earn intermittently an opportunity to actually get access to a mortgage, given that the current system doesn't give them access to something like that. Platforms like Moment that during COVID helped a museum raise money because it owned a piece of, it owned Nelson Mandela's arrest warrant. So that was turned into an NFT and people owned pieces of it. So I try to consistently engage my idea muscle by publishing this work and giving people sort of a view of how dynamic of a continent Africa is, and just have them understand it from the context of people that are actually building on the ground.
Thank you so much.